It's the Leading on Purpose podcast, helping leaders, teams, and organizations lead more intentionally, effectively, and with purpose. Well, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm back with Doug, and today an interesting topic. And for whatever reason, as we're kind of bouncing around ideas of what we could talk about and bring to you today, what was on our minds as we kind of exchanged notes was, how do you as an organization create a culture where the best possible versions of leadership for everyone throughout the organization are possible and expected? And give you a little bit around why we're bringing this question to the table. Just had some recent conversations with different organizations, different leaders around, one, what do some of the best organizations do? What differentiates them? And then conversely, where do organizations trip themselves up? And so, best I can say, and Doug and I will definitely refine this as we move through our conversation today, is organizations often just shoot themselves in the foot. They develop people, promote ideas around really the same styles of leadership we've talked about in a lot of our episodes, versions of leadership that include high levels of emotional intelligence, promote coaching, mentorship, development. But then for some reason, either by way of our processes, our standards, our systems as an organization, we're actually reinforcing something different. And it becomes this situation that leaders in the middle of the organization can find themselves a bit stuck, where they're saying, lead in a meaningful way, but hit your numbers. And so, Doug, how's that for kind of a setup for today's conversation?
Fantastic. First, it's good to see you again, John. And yeah, I love the way you set that up because this is messy. It's a messy topic. It takes a lot of hard ongoing work. This work never stops inside an organization to be very intentional about what do we stand for as an organization in terms of leadership, what expectations do we have of leaders, and then to continually stay close to it to know how well are we doing or not doing. And so you're talking about in some organizations seismic shifts in how they're led, how what's expected of leaders. And John, I think as I think about my many years of devoting my career to leadership development, for me, as we sit here today, and I think about 30 or 40 years ago when I started my work, I think today there is just such a deeper appreciation and understanding of how important the quality of leadership is in the success of the organization. And when I think about when I started my career, the very common mindset around leadership is people in leadership roles, they show up, they tell people what to do. You have very clear, accountable goals. And I love what you just said, just hit your numbers or whatever the equivalent of that is in a particular role. And as long as you got your numbers or hit your objectives or whatever you're being held accountable to, you got the great performance review, a pat on the back, sometimes the promotion, and say, job well done. And I think what we understand today is yes, you're in a business where numbers do need to be hit, but there's ways of doing it and not doing it. So I think our conversation today can just be an interesting time to reflect on how do you continue to make that kind of progress inside an organization? And how do you help leaders transition from maybe the way they used to lead to what's being expected of them today? So, big, messy topic that is really important, I know, to the long term success of organizations.
Yeah. So one of the beliefs I have is, and I think it's important to adopt this mindset, because you choose your attitude as you step into your workplace, and you choose the lens by which you see the organization that you work in. And so whether you're at the head of the organization, by the way, or in really deep inside the organization, I think it's really important that, in my observation, less of this than you think happens because of ill intent. And so
Right.
when organizations do find themselves talking out of both sides of their mouth, shooting themselves in the foot to a certain degree. Very rarely is that because a group of leaders got up in the morning and decided, how do we piss everyone off today?
Yeah.
That's very rarely the reason. And if you do work for someone that's how they're thinking, I apologize, and you probably need to do something about that. But more often than not, I think one of the reasons that there's this gravitation towards the numbers is it's more tangible. We can grab onto that. There's proof, there's evidence that if we focus on that, it's something we can grab onto versus some of these other fuzzier, messier, aspects of leadership and culture. They're a little harder to measure. They're a little harder to grab onto. And so I think that's one piece of this that really makes leadership in general kind of complex, but also this notion of how do you create the right culture in the organization that supports the type of leadership you really expect and want to see. That's a big piece of it. The other thing, that you kind of mentioned that I think is important here, there's some newness to this problem, but it is not a new problem. And so we've had experiences as a society the last several years, and I know COVID's very much in the rearview mirror now, but it was another reminder of how important people's experience in the workplace is. This, coaching side, the emotional intelligence that people feel they're experiencing from their leader. I'll just say, I think the new aspect of this problem is that the stakes are raised. And so, maybe as a final thought here, and then Doug, I want you to kind of weigh back in. I think there's a myth about today's working generation that needs to be avoided as well. And so, if one myth is, hey, don't make the assumption that your boss got up this morning with the intention of, making everyone mad today, making life hell. Neither did your CEO. The second myth to watch out for is when we think about today's generation, the incoming average members of our teams. There's this myth, I think, out there that the generation by and large is not loyal, not looking to be loyal to an organization. And because, you're seeing a lot of people take other opportunities, a lot of turnover taking place. Voluntary resignations are on the rise the last several years. And I think there's a myth there. There's not by way of, a lack of loyalty or lack of desire to be loyal to an organization. I think it's quite astute, actually. Because if I look back on my career, I remember stretches where maybe, now I was always proud of my loyalty, but maybe I was loyal to a fault. And I think today's generation has become very astute where I don't have to put up with a bad boss and a bad culture for very long. And so it's not lack of loyalty. It's, I know there's probably a leader down the street at a different organization trying to do the very things that I'm looking to get out of a leadership relationship. And so I don't have to stay here longer than 5 minutes if that's not what I'm getting here. And so just a couple myths to watch out for that I think play into our topic today.
Well, John, I would agree both of those myths. The first one that leaders intentionally want to do things during the day to wreak havoc in the workplace or upset their people, and I don't know, maybe there are a few out there that get their jollies doing that, but my experience is not so much. And by the way, as a side note, I think that's important to keep in mind that if you're working for someone, a leader, and they do one of those things that's upsetting to you, is have grace, and just assume that either they're not aware of the impact it's having or they're just having an off day like we all do. So I absolutely agree with that. And the loyalty issue, there is no doubt in my mind that the bar has just simply been raised.
Yeah.
What people expect of leaders. And I think with communication, the technology that we have today, in terms of job opportunities and what's out there and what you can read about organizations and their culture and different leaders, it's just so much easier to be aware of what else is available as an associate inside an organization that you're not experiencing. So as a result, leaders need to be even better at leading than they ever have before if they're going to retain their top talent. So I agree with you. I think, you know, individuals, the younger generation that are in an organization where they're treated well, they're led well, They feel the work they're doing is worthy. It's connected to a purpose in this world that they're excited about. There's no reason that they won't be there for a large number of years. I think personally, it's a lazy way for leaders to make excuses about why they lose people, saying, "Well, this generation just isn't loyal anymore." That's just bunk. So
Yep.
I absolutely agree with you, and it's just we live in a day and age where quality leadership is more important than ever before. Most transient talent pool we've ever had in the world.
Yeah.
And we just need to be better in terms of how we're leading and relating to our people.
Yeah, and I think it's connected back to something I mentioned earlier. When you come up with that conclusion, well, it must be because of their lack of loyalty. Um, that may be the easiest answer to grab onto. It's the most tangible thing. Well, I couldn't imagine what some of the other reasons would be why we're experiencing this, so it must be that. And so it is an easy, sometimes lazy, as you said, answer to conclusion to come to.
Well, it's like as we've talked about in prior conversations, especially around coaching, if someone is struggling with an issue in their life, and let's say the struggle this time is people leaving an organization, it's so much easier to externalize the reason for that happening than to internalize it. So it'd be very natural to say, well, the reason people are leaving my organization, especially the younger associates, is they're just not loyal, as opposed to starting with yourself first, saying, why is it that people are leaving this organization? What is it about the way they're being led, either individual leadership they're receiving or the collective leadership team that's here and the tone and the culture that's being set? And I'd start there first. Always start with yourself first, because that's where you control it. But John, as you and I know, that can be a real tough conversation to have with yourself, is to say, how am I contributing to this issue, either individually or more bigger picture inside an organization? What is the leadership culture like here that's causing people to leave? And I think that gets missed quite a bit.
Yep. Well, and I think that mirror check's another thing to do when you ask yourself this bigger question, which is our topic today. If I'm not seeing the quality of leadership I expect from the people I lead, what am I doing that's causing that?
Right.
What have I done that's contributed or created an environment where the quality of leadership I'm actually expecting is either not possible, not clear, but certainly not being delivered?
Yep.
And so I think it's a big aspect of this. So we mentioned this is not a new problem, but it's got some stakes are raised. It's got some new challenges associated with it in terms of the expectations the incoming generation brings to the workplace and to their leader. Um, but it's not, as I said, it's not a brand new problem. It's been around for quite a
Right.
while. And so, a few examples of what this looks like when organizations will shoot themselves in the foot that I've had over the years. Uh, for one, obviously, you and I have both have had the opportunity to provide a lot of programmatic development experiences
Mhm.
for organizations where we're brought in to design a program that's then going to be offered to audiences year in and year out, and seen some great result and impact, by the way, out of those types of programs. But I will tell you, some of the organizations that are challenged with this bigger question we're asking, hey, how do I create a culture that promotes the type of leadership we actually expect and would like to see? Um, one of the places I've noticed it is as you and I have graduated leaders from some of these programs. Um, one of the things to look at the top levels of the organization, if we're developing people through our our programs, our trainings, the offerings we have as an organization, we better make sure at the top level of the organization we're aligned with the same
Right.
methodologies and approach to leadership, so that we're not setting up people to fail. And I have had a couple of experiences where even as the facilitator, I felt kind of bad, where it's like I may have set this audience a little sideways because what we've promoted and developed them on is so far from what
Yep.
maybe they're actually experiencing. And as they step out of this program, could be a source of some frustration.
Yep.
And so I think that's one place to maybe, I don't know if you say start, but one place to look is there a dichotomy, a separation between how we're developing leaders and, at the top level of the organization, whether or not we've adopted those same methodologies and approaches to leadership. So observations and experiences with that's a big one
Y-
for me.
Yeah, it's been big for me as well, John. And um, what I'm about to say is not real good news, but it's the reality that I've experienced in the work that I've done. More times than not, when I had been invited into organizations that had a sense that they needed to lead differently, we needed to develop different behaviors in our leaders to create a better culture that's going to more fully engage folks. Um, rarely, rarely did that initial work begin with the senior team. And many times it would be the senior team approving it,
Yeah.
the senior team approving the funding for it. Uh, Probably if I even had an audience with the senior team, what it would look like is I would be invited to one of their executive meetings and be granted a half an hour to review the outline of the program, the objectives, some of the philosophies that were being taught, to at least make sure they weren't headed down a path with me that was just something they couldn't embrace. But what was missing in that is their willingness to experience the development, receive the feedback, do the deep work that leaders need to do. Um, and I'm not really certain why that is. I mean, the lamest excuse I would typically hear from senior leaders is we can't take 3 days to totally immerse ourselves into. We just don't have that kind of time, which is just crap. um, how we spend our time is a reflection of our priorities. So apparently, there were a lot of other things more important to senior leaders than really taking a look at themselves as a leader and their collective impact as a senior leadership team. And then there were other senior leadership teams that I never even met. So you're working with kind of middle level of management. And as you said, John, you and I were fortunate enough to do a lot of work together over the years. And I know we made a big difference, a positive difference for a lot of the leaders that we worked with. And we also know stories of some of those leaders that went to different organizations because they were just frustrated, because the development experience opened their eyes to a new and different way of leading, not only for them, but then they started to think, how much better could I be if my leader were to lead me this way? And they would exit the organization. It's like, this just isn't being embraced here. So I think, to me, we talk about the messiness of, right off the top of this conversation around truly developing cultures that are aligned around leadership principles. Eventually, if the senior team isn't not just part of the conversation, but is deeply committed to their own development, it's really, really difficult to make this work. And I've seen it happen both when I was in my corporate career. One organization I was in, it started at the top and it transformed the organization. And a few of the clients I worked with over the years, we approached it that way, but that's definitely the exception and not the rule. So that's anybody listening to this, particularly at a senior level of the organization, might be something to really think about. Is, are we committed to this and willing to be on the journey with the rest of the leaders in the organization?
Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen what also can separate the pack. Um, it, are organizations, leadership teams who have not just a commitment to promoting and leading, the way they'd like to see throughout the organization and the way that maybe the leadership development programming is going to be aimed, is having alignment themselves. Have we had the conversation at the senior level of the organization to agree on what does great leadership look like in the context of our organization? What are the expectations? What type of leadership is it going to take for us to deliver on our objectives as an organization? And
Yeah.
so it's to me, it's part of that vision, mission, strategy conversation is getting clear, getting aligned. What does great leadership look like here in our organization? And if possible, I've also seen it be beneficial. What's on the other end when we do that? How are employees left to feel? And so, whether you call it the employee value proposition, some of this cascades into the values of the organization that you want people to live and operate by, wherever it ends up. Also, defining what's it look like when we lead the way we expect to lead? How are
Yes.
people left feeling? Can we put a phrase or some verbiage to what the culture is intended to feel like? That to me has been a differentiator for organizations that I think do a good job of not talking out of both sides of their mouths when they say numbers and culture, numbers and great leadership. Um, those two don't become exclusive to each other; they become intertwined.
Yeah. I think, John, what gives me hope, and I probably won't be on this earth long enough to see this play out, but my hope is, the new and different ways of thinking about leadership and the role of leadership. And you and I have talked about conscious capitalism in some of our conversations, and any of our listeners that have ever read the book on conscious capitalism or are familiar with it, it is a very much aligned with what you and I believe to be true about effective leadership and what's required of leaders. But some of this thinking is relatively still new on the scene. So if you think about folks that typically sit in the C suites today, what their typical age is and experience, their formative years of leadership development were during times where these ideas around leadership just were just barely on the scene, if at all. And so for some leaders that have been leading a certain way and they've been very successful in terms of promotions, in terms of accumulation of wealth and achieving business objectives. Sometimes it's really hard to get their attention and say, yeah, but there's even a better way to lead. So what gives me hope is, have we had enough exposure to younger leaders in organizations? I'm not just talking about the work we did. That's just a drop in the bucket. But I do think there's just so much more awareness with younger leaders inside of organizations around what leadership is about, how to get the best of people, the best version of leadership that they can bring forward. Those folks are either in or getting very close to being in the C suite in organizations. So to me, 20, 30 years from now, it'll be really interesting to see, has there been a fundamental shift in terms of leadership philosophies, how to treat people, how to lead people, that we're not seeing as much as we need to today, but has the foundation and the conversation started that's going to lead to a generation of senior leaders over the next several decades that do see the world differently and the relationship with their people and their organization differently. I hope so. That would be my hope.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that brings to mind is how often people are a victim of their own success.
Hmm.
And so, for any of our listeners, I think paying attention to your own leadership styles, let's say, what you gravitate to, what you hold as important, and the perceptions you give your team. Ask yourself, are you a victim of your own success? And is
Yep.
part of the reason you don't shift some of your approach to leadership because you've been getting quote unquote results.
Yep.
And so, as you and I have talked about so many times, some of this is imagining, well, yeah, maybe I have been quote unquote successful delivering results. What could they have been?
Right.
And so I think that's
Yep.
the big fundamental question here when we think about an organization's culture and the type of leadership we expect and hope we would see as we look at our organization and talk to employees and ask them, what's the culture like? Well, what we want to hear is, hey, I'm being led in a meaningful way, and here's how it's impacting my ability to do some things I didn't even know I was capable of. Like that's what you hope you would hear.
Yep.
So,
John,
yeah, go ahead.
well, I was going to say, at the top of the conversation, we just talked about how, one, this is a huge topic. It's a messy topic. How do you align leadership behaviors, practices, values inside an organization? So if somebody's listening to this conversation today and they're like, you know what, we need to do things differently inside our organization. John, what's your experience told you is an initial starting point? How do you go from awareness of, wow, we need to do this differently? What's been your observations and experience in terms of how do you just jump in and begin this journey in a way that's going to be meaningful, and the odds of seeing that kind of transition are, much higher?
Yeah, it's a big problem with, and that's a big question. But a few thoughts and things that I have seen organizations be successful with. One I mentioned earlier, which is asking yourself the question: are we aligned at the top level of the organization in terms
Yep.
of what we would define as quality leadership, effective leadership? And again, carrying that through to what is the employee experience intended to look like on the other side of receiving quality leadership? And so do we have clear definitions around all that and alignment around all of that? And so that's where it starts, because as you cascade misalignment, mixed messaging from the top level down
Yep.
through the organization, that's where some of these shooting ourselves in the foot moments start to happen as people, you know, start receiving mixed messages. Well, if we're not even aligned at the top level, surprise, surprise, we shouldn't be surprised. The other piece of this is maybe examining some of the individual experiences and examples that you can get your hands on in your organization. Uh, and so I dealt with one recently where, and I've dealt with this more than once, where it's, hey, basically we want to invest in some development or coaching for a person or a particular set of leaders. And as they describe the challenges that they're having, the challenges are related to the quality and effectiveness of leadership that the person is providing. And so then the question becomes, well, how are they being held accountable? And lo and behold, the things that this leader or these leaders are typically being held accountable to have nothing to do with effective quality leadership. They have everything to do with numbers. And so I guess the second thing to look at is, if we have alignment at the top level, what are the systems, processes, everything we do from the lens of accountability to hold people accountable and have conversations related to quality and effective leadership. And this is where, organizations, I think, shoot themselves in the foot. We want quality leadership, but you better hit your numbers. Well, what do people hear if that's the message? Well, they hear numbers. And by the way, this is something that gets in the way when we're working in situations that involve change leadership. If you're wondering why people, aren't leading in an effective quality way, or are, more broadly, aren't adopting the change and executing on the things you want to see shifted by way of the change that you're implementing, ask yourself, well, what are the processes and systems of accountability and standards in our organization? What are those things telling people is important, telling people to do? And so I don't know why this popped into my mind, but there was a book that I'm sure you read. It's been around for a number of years, but in my last corporate position, this became standard read in the learning and development department, and it was Analyzing Performance Problems by Robert Mager. And so if you get a chance in the audience out there, check out this book. I think it's a really interesting read. Probably the most interesting part of the book is a flow chart they came up with to really help you understand inside an organization when someone isn't doing X. So let's say in this case, they're not effectively leading people, leading in a quality manner. It gives you a flow chart, a list of questions to ask yourself as to why that person isn't doing what you want them to do. And so the first couple questions you ask yourself are very obvious. Are expectations clear? Well, if not, we got to ask ourselves, how do we make it clear in terms of the leadership we expect to see? Is performance quality visible? Do we have mechanisms and systems that would tell people whether they're doing it or not doing it in terms of the quality of their leadership? Down the list, here's two of the more interesting questions that I think trip organizations and leaders up. Is proper performance punishing, and is improper performance rewarding? So think about that for a minute and ask yourself that question. When you think about the leadership expectations you have in your organization, is it easier for people to lead the wrong way, to lead by way of the numbers? And does it feel to them like it penalizes them to slow down and lead in a more effective quality manner? And so that goes far beyond the things that you're saying to people, and that goes into your systems and processes within your organization. And so those are a few places to start, Doug, and maybe not in perfect order. Starts
Yeah.
at the top, and then once there's that alignment at the top, what are the rest of the systems and processes telling people they ought to be doing versus not doing? Because that's
Yeah.
when you find resistance in an organization, people's pushback to leading this way, people's pushback to change. One of those core answers is, well, I'm not willing to do it because I'm still being held accountable for all the old stuff, the numbers, the scorecard that we've always used. And so while this leadership stuff sounds intriguing and I'd love to do it, it's not I don't want to. You're telling me not to. And so I'm not willing to adopt the change, adopt these leadership ways because I'm being bonused, given merit increases, and promoted based on the same old stuff we've always been talking about. And
Yeah.
so it's such an important stumbling block that has to be examined.
Yeah, it's yeah. And John, I'm just as I'm listening to that the picture that you just painted, that's a challenging place, I think, for any leader to be, whether you're in senior leadership role in an organization where by position you're in a much better situation to make change. But probably for a lot of folks listening to this conversation today, they're not even in the C-suite. And so they may be asking themselves, so John and Doug, are you saying nothing's going to happen until those folks in the C-suites do something about it? And ideally, it'd be great if it was coming from there. But John, I was just reflecting on what you just said. The questions to ask yourself, the things to do are available to a leader no matter where they sit
Yes.
in the organization. And
Yes.
I know even in my own career, the few organizations I worked in, I just was restless and dissatisfied and, not happy with the quality of leadership I was receiving. I remember having some really tough conversations with myself saying, do I have it within me the desire to at least be the best possible leader I can be from where I sit in the organization? And am I willing to no longer allow the crappy leadership I'm getting from my leader to be the reason that I'm not leading the way that I know I can lead? And I will tell you, there are a few times where the answer to me is no, I don't have it within me. I just don't care enough, and it's time for me to move on. I do remember one specific situation where I was frustrated. It's like, I love my team. I really enjoy this industry that I'm working in, and chances are my boss is not going to change dramatically on their own. But what I do control is me. And so I remembered probably doing some of the most. This was pretty early in my career. I think I would have been around 32 or 33, really doing some soul searching and some deep work development, to really identify what I thought was true about leadership and how it's going to lead. And it made a difference. I mean, it was noticeable to the team. And, John, you and I have seen this in organizations, little pockets of success all over the place,
Yeah.
where it's like, wow, that team's got it going on over there. Their turnover's low, people seem engaged. They're not just hitting numbers, they're blowing numbers out. What in the world is going on over there? And it is interesting to me, over the years, I've seen those situations where, despite being surrounded with poor leadership, they're getting it done because they made the decision to make it happen. So, if you're listening and sitting with these thoughts with John and I today, and there's some curiosity and some energy around that, don't discount what you singly can do as a leader with your team. But to me, the big decision was, is it worth it to do that here? And sometimes I said, yeah, and I went for it. And other times, like, no, this work environment is so toxic, is just so diametrically opposed to what I believe in terms of leadership. I'm just done, spending time in my career here. So it's hard, and I just want to put that out there. It doesn't I don't want people to hear us say, well, you've got it, unless your senior team's doing something about it, you have no chance. It sure as hell helps if they are.
Yeah.
But wherever you sit in the organization, there's opportunity if you're willing to take on the hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for me, some of that hard work, and I know you and I have both had on occasion opportunities to recommend this to people, whether it's through coaching one to one,
Right.
or certainly as people graduate from a program and are kind of re entering the real world, re entering the wild sometimes. Um, it's like, how do I enact change as it relates to the leadership, not only I'm going to provide, but that I'd like to see? So maybe a couple tips and tricks. One would certainly be, and we've talked about this in more than one conversation already, is the managing up conversation and finding a constructive way to relate to your boss, the things you need to be at your leadership best.
Yep.
So that's one tactic. Maybe related to that, and this is one I've seen work well, particularly if you're in a situation where the message you're getting is conflicting. Lead well, but hit your numbers. And if you examine your priorities, you've got some conflicts there. I'm a big fan of not uh, forcing that down your boss's throat, but presenting it in a way that sounds like, hey, I need you to help me choose which option here. Both of these realities don't fit together. I have some ideas on how they could fit differently. Which one of these makes the most sense to you, is most important to you? Help me choose, because these are at odds with each other and they both can't happen at the same time. And so I'm a big fan, if there is that opportunity to manage up a bit or even talk to the senior team, it's, hey, challenge them, help me make a choice here.
Yeah.
You've sent two conflicting messages, and I'm here to tell you, I'd love nothing more than to be able to execute on both at a high level. I need you to choose one. Which is it? And so just maybe a couple helpful tips to start with. What else can people do, take on here?
Well, it's we've touched on it in some other conversations, but it's also this idea of to the extent possible, getting clarity on how I'm leading today and the impact that it's having. And we've prior conversations talked about different tools and assessments that are available to do that. Just another hit on that, saying that um, it is a risky proposition, even if you're committed as a leader to be a more effective leader, is to simply operate from your own perspective of yourself. There has to be a way to invite that feedback and perspective from other people into the picture. And John, you and I both have gone through extensive assessment processes over the years, and we've talked about it before, where sometimes it reinforced for us things that we thought we were really good at. It also reinforced some things that, man, I know that's a learning edge for me. But the tougher part of that are the surprises, especially things that you thought you were doing well and you weren't.
Yeah.
And so that's the other part of this for me is it's great organizationally if there's a systematic way that you're routinely evaluating the quality of leadership. I'm a big fan of that, and that speaks volumes to the commitment an organization has around what they believe to be true about leadership and holding leaders accountable. So if you have that in your organization, that's terrific. But if not, then how do I, as a leader, start to have conversations with people to get a better, deeper sense of what's working well in my leadership, what's not working well in my leadership that would allow you to be even more effective in your job? So if that's not a routine part of your leadership regimen, is having those conversations, whether formally through an assessment process or just informally in conversations with folks, I can't stress enough how important that is. Without that information, you're just guessing. And sometimes you guess right. Sometimes I would guess, well, here are the two things if I did differently as a leader would really improve my effectiveness for my team. And I might get them right, or it's a total miss. And they're still frustrated with things that I'm doing or not doing that are standing in their way. So, John, that would be one thing for me is you have to have something in place to gain that kind of clarity and feedback for yourself.
Yeah. And that opens kind of a big door, which is just the broader topic of being good as a leader and potentially as an organization, soliciting feedback
Yep.
about these things. And, there's different ways to do that. We've, as you said, kind of, beat it to death in terms of the various assessment tools and ways you can do that. But I've seen some other approaches are on the heels of presenting new information or new expectations related to, let's say, an employee value proposition or the rollout of a strategy that's got some people centric aspects to it, or even on the heels of a development experience. Those can be great times to
Yeah.
solicit feedback, to ask people the question, okay, if this is our North Star, this is where we want to go in terms of the quality of leadership we want to provide and the resulting culture we intend to create. What stands in our way? What
Yep.
about our current environment would make that reality hard? Or if you're talking to folks that are just graduating from, let's say, a development program that your organization puts on, hey, in light of everything you learned, what's going to be hardest in terms of leading this way in the current state of this organization?
Yeah.
And so that broader topic, it's a big door you got to step through, is just how good are we at soliciting feedback consistently for people? Do people feel
Yeah.
safe telling us, hey, I'm not just going to sit on these conflicting priorities. We've got a conflict here that needs to be resolved. And so there's a safety component of this as well that I think you've got to challenge yourself with.
Yeah. John, the organizations, when I think about the role model organizations that I've been familiar with over the years, one of the things that they hold in common is that feedback process that you just described is present. It's routine. So maybe be really bold for me to say it's impossible not to have that kind of leadership alignment and accountability around leadership without feedback. It's hard for me to imagine how you achieve that without it. And the equation two, the courage it takes to use the feedback to make decisions. And here's what I mean by that. And I'm thinking of one um, particular example, although I've seen this numerous times in organizations, when organizations actually put in place a feedback process to gauge how leaders are leading and the impact they're having. I think one of the more interesting situations is when you uncover a situation where you have a leader that is hitting numbers and the way they're leading is not at all aligned with what the organization stands for. And to me, the courage part, and when I've seen this play out, it takes courage, is to have that conversation with a leader that says no. And, the old mindset would be as long as you're hitting your numbers, how you're leading is fine, as long
Right.
as you get the numbers. But to sit with a leader and let them know it's not fine. And I can I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with particularly senior leaders that are aware that they have a leadership issue on their team. They don't need an assessment to
Yeah.
know it. They just know.
You can feel it.
Everybody knows it. I remember being very direct with a CEO one time saying, you understand, everybody in this organization, there was somebody reported to this individual, they know how toxic this person is in the organization. Yeah, I know, but boy, if they were to leave right now, we'd be in a world of hurt. I said, it's more reflection. People are talking more about you as the CEO than they are this person that you are knowingly allowing this to happen inside your organization. It's no longer about this poor leader. It's all about you and the frustration people have. How can you, as CEO, allow this to continue? And that was probably one of the more intense conversations I ever had
I imagine so.
with a leader. And it actually was exactly what this person needed to hear. Now we did some things just to confirm how bad their leadership was, and it was terrible, and they did take action. But it just shocks me sometimes how long these situations will be allowed to continue, and how people know that it's going on, but this hesitation because they're getting numbers or they have relationships with people in the industry or customers. I've seen that play out too. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, if I let this person go, we've got some key customers that are going to walk with them to some other organization.
Yeah.
And it's once you find yourself being held hostage to not doing what you know is right because of those concerns, you're in a world of hurt because they're having more damage inside your organization with your people than you probably even begin to realize. the last thing I would say about it too is I also believe there's an obligation if a leader's been leading a certain way and they're called on it, is to know that the organization has also played a role in that as well.
Yep.
And so, John, anytime I'm involved in these kind of transformations inside organizations, I say, we get this first round of data and assessment, and we get a much clearer understanding of how people are leading. What is the grace that you're going to bring to those conversations, and what level of ownership? Let's say you're the CEO, where you almost apologize to the person, saying, you know what, I've allowed your leadership and the way you're leading to go on for the last 10 years. That's on me. I failed you for not having this conversation sooner. Now we need to talk about from this day forward how it's going to be different and what's the plan to make it different. And even give them this opportunity to decide, am I interested? Because I've also seen that play out where the person's like, well, no, I don't want to change. This is just who I am. If you're that unhappy with my leadership, I'll go somewhere else. So that's the messiness of this. And I also think even leaders that aren't performing well is to have that human element of compassion and empathy for people and be on the journey with them for as long as reasonable.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about, well, take the next 10 years to transition, but
Right.
it's amazing, I think, with the appropriate level of vulnerability, encouragement, support, leaders can make changes pretty quickly if they're willing to do that. And it takes their people a bit of time to accept those changes if they're going to accept them at all. So anyway, those are really tough conversations to have, but really important ones.
Well, and so maybe as a final thought here, a question you can ask yourself about your organization: is the cardinal sin within our organization not hitting your numbers? Or is the cardinal sin in your organization not treating employees well, not leading well?
Right.
And so, this whole notion that we've been talking about, this whole conversation about lead well, but hit your numbers, ask yourself that question. What do we actually, at the end of the day, care about and hold people accountable to as an organization? Is it leading effectively, or is it just hitting your numbers, and we'll take the collateral damage that comes with that?
Yeah.
Great
Well,
conversation, Doug.
yep.
You have
Same here.
another thought there?
Well, I was going to say, and the beautiful part of this story that I really believe to be true, and evidence would suggest it, is it's not an either or story.
Yes.
It's leading well and leading differently. Maybe in the short term, there's a bit of a dip, but it transforms organizations that can take performance to levels you never, ever imagined possible before. So it's leading well and it's driving success in the organization. However you measure that success, it's all possible,
Well,
and it's worth the effort for sure.
it is, and it's a great point. We don't want anyone taking this conversation as evidence that this is about an inattention to results and numbers. This
Right.
is around achieving success that's built for the long term by
Correct.
way of the leadership and culture we provide and create in the organization. Great topic, man. That was fun.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Appreciate all of you tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tune in for our next conversation coming up soon.